Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air Global Network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Deborah Goodrich Royce. Deborah's thrillers examine puzzles of identity. Ruby Falls won the Zibby Award for Best Plot Twist in 2021, and Finding Mrs. Ford was hailed by Forbes, Book Riot, and Good Morning America's Best of list in 2019. She began as an actress on All My Children and in multiple films before transitioning to the role of story editor at Miramax Films, developing Emma and early versions of Chicago and A Wrinkle in Time. With her husband, Chuck, Deborah restored the Avon Theatre, Ocean House Hotel, Deer Mountain Inn, United Theatre, Savoy Bookstore, and numerous Main Street revitalization projects, in Rhode Island and the Catskills. Deborah serves on the governing and advisory boards of the American Film Institute, Greenwich International Film Festival, New York Botanical Garden, Greenwich Historical Society, and the PRASAD Project. Deborah holds a bachelor's degree in modern foreign languages and an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Lake Erie College. Whew, you are such a qualified lady. Welcome, Deborah.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me, Danielle. Very happy to see you again over the ethers.
Exactly. So happy to have you. So excited to talk about REEF Road, which I am seeing everywhere. It's getting lots of exciting advanced buzz, which you can tell us about. But first, tell our listeners about REEF Road.
Sure. So I like to say the road to REEF Road was long. In December, exactly 74 years ago, December of 1948, my mother's best friend was murdered. It was December the 10th. It was a Friday night in Pittsburgh. My mother was supposed to be there that night at her friend's house. As I said, it was a Friday night, and the girls were 12, and she ended up being home alone. And by the time the parents came home at 11:30 at night, there was a trail of blood going from the kitchen to the dining room. The telephone table was tipped over, and she'd been stabbed 36 times. She was not yet dead. She died at the hospital, and this has remained an unsolved crime. So it's something that's always percolated in my head. As you would know, there's a very real syndrome when people exist, let's call it next door to violence. When something really terrible happens to someone you love, you are affected as well. If you think about the writer Dominic Dunn, his daughter was murdered in Hollywood in 1984, and he completely pivoted his life around after this murder to become this reporter at what became the biggest criminal trials that went on for years, including O.J. Simpson and Michael Skakel and on and on. And I think it was very much a result of what happened to his daughter and his frustration with the whole process. Then if you think about Michelle McNamara, she wrote that book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark.
Mm-hmm.
There was a girl who had been murdered in her hometown when she was growing up, and she became what later, so they were called disparagingly in my mother's era. The people who were running around trying to solve the murder of my mother's friend were disparagingly called citizen detectives. By the time of Michelle McNamara, it was a much more respectable term. So she wrote this book. She died in the process, but she was instrumental in really solving a case of a serial killer who came to be known as a state killer. So you know about that.
I read her book. That's a fabulous book too. And she did die, unfortunately, but before seeing that guy.
She did. So for me, it's always been in my consciousness that this is what happened to my mother's friend. I've known that my mother has had certain nervousness at home. You know, the home alarm system is a very good thing for someone like my mother. It has really given her a lot of comfort, because for my mom, she always perceived that someone could come from the outside into your home and do harm.
Right.
So in March of 2020, COVID joined us in the world. We didn't know what was happening. We have a house in Florida. I was down in Florida, and we were kind of grounded there. So I began the research process into this real murder. And believe it or not, now there's a lot of material on the internet, because, everything is uploaded into the cloud. And as I was researching it, I thought, I don't want to write this as nonfiction. I like to write fiction anyway. I think you can get to the essence of what you're talking about without all the details, factual details.
Yeah.
For example, the real murdered girl had 2 brothers. I started writing this with the girl having 2 brothers, but someone who read it early on said, well, what's the point of the additional brother? Because one brother was and has remained a suspect in this unsolved crime to this day. And so my reader was absolutely right. There was no purpose for this extraneous brother. It just muddied the works. And that's what you can do in fiction, where if you're writing nonfiction, you really just have to report it as it was. So I began the research process, which then turned into what became REEF ROAD. And quick description, it's a dual narrative set in Palm Beach during the COVID lockdown, spring of 2020. And it's the story of a writer, on the one hand, who's researching the murder of her mother's best friend. And it's a story of a younger woman who's married to a very handsome fellow from Argentina. And a couple weeks into the pandemic lockdown, he's last seen by security cameras in his face mask getting on a plane for Buenos Aires. And because of the border closures, because of COVID, the wife can't follow. So you are tracking the story of the writer and the wife in this same town, in this claustrophobia of COVID, and you're trying to unravel what one has to do with the other.
And the husband, Miguel, got on that plane with the children. So she's now separated from her 2 children, which, that is kind of every mother's worst nightmare. And because she's not a citizen of Argentina, she's not allowed to go there. But of course, he was able to travel with the children. So that's terrifying. So that's it. So that's interesting. So clearly the writer perspective is very much sort of autobiographically inspired. And I agree with you on the point. Plus, when we write fiction, we get to imagine what the conversations would look like and how it was, and much more about sort of how that impacted the character's mother. We get to, because the character, of course, because if it impacts the mother, then it obviously impacts the character, right? Because we're all very influenced by our parents, and particularly, as it seems, our mothers. So I'm curious about the other side of that. So, it made sense. It makes total sense to me that was sort of the inspiration for that, the writer's side. What, can you sort of look at what the seed was for the woman who, the wife? Is there how that came to you?
So, yeah, I would say I'm a great lover of film noir. There's a very noir aspect to Linda Alonso's story. I think I rewatched not Body Double, although that's a good one. I rewatched Body Heat. That's the one that's set right next to Palm Beach in Lantana, Florida, with Kathleen Turner and William Hurt. If you haven't seen it in a while, you should rewatch it. And if you know, in noir, the woman is always up to something. So there's a shadow of doubt hanging around Linda Alonso from the get-go. She's 40, which I would consider young at my age.
Me too.
She's quite beautiful. And she has this perfect husband, perfect children. But as we all know, when everything seems to be so perfect, you better guess it is not. So, there are funny things in her story. There's a lag in her reporting the fact that her husband and children are missing, which is a funny little thing to do. It's an odd thing. She falls asleep. She's so distraught, she falls asleep.
Right. It doesn't quite ring true to us. Right. And then she, she sort of befriends accidentally a police officer, which, once you have a police officer in your vicinity, every little hole in your story gets sort of blown up because you let him into your, into sort of see what's going on. And that is sort of raises the stakes for her. And
Yes.
yeah, it is. I mean, I think we do all differ in how we respond to really acute stress, but falling asleep seems to be low on the list of things that we would do in that
It's
moment.
not in my stress response repertoire.
Not usually.
The other thing I was playing with was it was sort of meta, in a way. Well, so the writer's sections really read like journal entries, and the sections of the wife read like a book within a book. So you kind of get the feeling that the writer is writing this book, but you can't really tell, I think, for a while, if Linda Alonso's story is really playing out in Palm Beach, nearby to the writer, or is it this just completely made up in her head? Because the writer, of course, is very cerebral. And it was very interesting playing with some of those meta aspects of the writer, because she's very self-referential to the reader. She really does talk about writing techniques. She talks about real murders. She talks about a whole host of things. You're with her in her mind. And it was one of those things that I was writing. I thought, does this even work? Is anybody even going to get it? But you know how it is. You kind of, at a certain point, you have to write what you're writing. You have to keep going. You have to commit. And so I've been very pleasantly surprised that no one has complained about that. In fact, they've kind of liked it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And actually, I think she is such an interesting character too. The writer is, and I think probably there's some insanity, whether it's diagnosable or not, in all writers, because we spend so much of our lives inhabiting, other brains, if you will. But that, this writer in particular, like she's quirky, right? She's not been married, and she obviously has no children, and she has a dog, and I mean who she talks to, and I feel like there's a lot of the sort of those details that make us also sort of wonder what is exactly going on with her. There's no sort of like, both characters are somewhat unreliable.
Very much so.
Which makes for fun.
So. And I think the redeeming characteristic of each character is her ability to love. The writer very much loves her dog, and Linda very much loves her children.
Yes.
After that, it's a little bit of a toss-up of who they are.
Right.
And of course, my mother, who's very much still alive, I had to let her know, listen, Mom, for dramatic purposes, I made the writer and her mother a lot crazier than we are. So,
right. Oh, that's another fun of fiction, right? You've got right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did she read it? Has your mother read it?
She has read it, and I think she's glad it's been written. It is very tough material for her. So some of the things I can say, it's based on a real case. The primary suspect in the real case always has been the girl's brother. He is still alive. I don't refer to the case. I don't name it. It is not hard to figure out what it is if anybody wants to go down a research rabbit hole. But I think for my mother, a couple of things along the way have really kind of lessened her burden. There's a thing in the story where the writer connects with a prosecutor who reopens the case. That really happened. We have a friend who's a prosecutor. I was talking to you earlier offline. We go to the Catskill Mountains, lower mountains than where you are in beautiful Montana, but they're gorgeous mountains, part of the Appalachian chain. And we have a dear friend there who ran the New York State Prosecutors Training Institute. And when I was telling him this story in 2008, which was at that point 60 years after the real crime, and I told him all the details, he said, it was the brother. I said, why do you say that? He said, you don't stab someone 36 times unless it's personal. And he got the case reopened. That case,
Interesting.
they looked at the file, they saw all this information about the brother, which I've put in the book, and they found fabric in a box, property room, which, you know, all these cops got excited. They sent the fabric to Quantico, Virginia, to the FBI lab. They wanted a 60-year-old DNA conviction, but it was compromised. It's, you know, why DNA lasts or doesn't last, what it remains on. Like you think about the Romanovs, you know, they're always exhuming bodies, and is this a Romanov or not a Romanov? And they pull a hair out of the head of somebody. But the fabric was degraded. There was no DNA to be had. So I feel like this will remain unsolved forever. On the other hand, I feel like in a certain way, I've said something about this girl and her life. So she's not unknown to the world, even though it's not her name.
Right. No, I think that's important. And I mean, I think that is it's always interesting to hear the prosecutor, because that, you know, that's a lot of times to stab somebody. So my, you know, our inclination is also, like you said, to sort of think, well, that's very personal, and who had access to the house. And the thing about this book, since we're talking about, you know, one of the suspects, is clearly this is not a whodunit, right? This is a very different story. So we're not ruining anything about the sort of the fabulousness of Reef Road by talking about this case and who was the suspect and whatever. Because I, you know, I spent a lot of this book being like, and it's good. It adds momentum. It makes it compulsive. I'm like, what are these two women all about? What is happening here? You know, and you know, I do this thing where I tab all these the fun spots. I always do that in all the books I read. Like,
I like to see all those tabs.
I know, lots of little places, things I love. But anyway, but I mean, that is sort of what's really fun about the book, is it's a different type of, you know, thriller and suspense novel. So, you know, and I'm embarrassed to admit this is my first of your books that I've read, but you know, obviously you have incredible accolades, and I look forward to reading the others. Is this generally how? I mean, clearly this is unique in the fact that you had a very personal connection to crime. But how do stories generally sort of manifest for you? Is it a nugget, a person?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So this will be my third published book. I'm working on a fourth. The nugget of each is different. So for Finding Mrs. Ford, that's a story that takes place in two time periods, and it begins in two places, two very different places. And it begins in a gorgeous seaside resort community where the FBI shows up at the home of Mrs. Ford to ask her about an Iraqi Chaldean man. And Chaldeans are a Catholic group from Iraq, a very specific group. And she claims that she doesn't know him. And they, of course, say, well, that's a little funny. He just took a plane from Baghdad to Boston, and we picked him up on the way to your house. You go back, so this is 2014. It's right at the moment when ISIS is first in the papers, and ISIS is marauding over the north of Iraq, killing a lot of people, including many Chaldeans. You go back to 1979 Detroit, which is 35 years earlier. She's a college student, and through meeting this kind of glamorous, exotic other girl, Annie Nelson, who's kind of a Zelda Fitzgerald character, young Susan Ford takes a very sketchy job at a very sketchy disco on the edge of Detroit, which happens to be frequented by Iraqi Chaldean men. They're a big population in Detroit.
Interesting.
So you know what the setup there? She's lying. She obviously knows this guy. Why is he looking for her 35 years later?
Right.
Why is she lying?
Right.
So that book plays out, you know, with that unraveling. The second book, Ruby Falls, is more gothic. And Ruby Falls, weirdly, I've never had this happen before. The first two chapters just came to me. There's a cave near Chattanooga, Tennessee called Ruby Falls. And the beginning, where a little girl, also by the name of Ruby, is in this cave with her father, and the lights are off, which is what they did back in the day in these waterfall caves. and the tour guide is saying, you know, when the divers have dived down and they've never been able to find the bottom, and the child is paralyzed with fear. She can't tell where the waterfall is. She doesn't want to fall in. And her father lets go of her hand and he abandons her in this cave. And that is sort of the primal trauma for her.
Yeah.
And she grows up to become an actress. She marries a tall, dark, handsome stranger she barely knows. And it plays out more like Rebecca. You know, if you remember the beginning of Rebecca, where the unnamed character marries Max de Winter. So each book has a different genesis. I grew up in Detroit. We have a house in Watch Hill. I was an actress. I've been to Ruby Falls. Nobody left me there. So, yeah, I mean, I use bits and pieces and little nuggets of inspiration from my life. But for me, it's always a kernel of inspiration. The first book was something I'd been mulling over for a long time. I had known a girl when I was in college who was very glamorous and very beautiful and kind of charismatic and a little, you know, wilder. And so I always thought about that female friendship relationship and how those relationships influence us perhaps to do things that we might not naturally do.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Especially as young people, right? When we
Yes.
don't exactly know who we are. That is exactly right.
I did not know who I was, did not at all.
Well, I think that's, I mean, my daughter's 20, almost 23, and I say, how could you can't possibly know who you are. I'm 52 and I'm just figuring it out. So you have a lot of time, you know. So those are super interesting. And it does, like, you are clearly very woven into these stories in one way or another, which I love, because I don't know that everybody writes things that feel so sort of like from their own fabric, which which clearly you do. Now, when you're writing, when you start a book, do you have a sense for how the things come together in the end? Are you a plotter? How does the process work?
No, I'm more of a pantser. So let's talk about REEF ROAD. It began with the research of the real crime. Layered over that was actually being in Palm Beach at the time, and it was hot. It was hotter than normal. It was buggier than normal. So all of that started playing into, you know, the creation of the story, and then wanting to play with kind of this noir element. So what I do a few things. I definitely research. I definitely do notes. I take copious notes. But my notes are more along the lines of what if this, what if that. Let's say it's a story about a woman who goes out in a boat and disappears. I don't have any of those, but let's say it's that. So, and let's say her name is Susan. It's always a good name. So what if Susan goes out in the boat and there's somebody out there? What if someone's hiding on the boat? What if she doesn't really get on the boat? I start doing those what if which generally lead to where I'm going a little bit through trial and error, through exploration. I also do another weird thing where I print out, let me grab it. I print these day at a page.
Oh,
Or a month at a page.
Yeah.
And when I go through, I start writing things down. So particularly whatever I said there, Ingrid moves to Los Angeles. So particularly if I have a non-linear story, this is a very weird and tactile visual thing. So finding Mrs. Ford, you track an object. There's a necklace that is spoken of, and the story is non-linear twice. You're back and forth from 2014 and 1979. Crescendo, and then you need to look at it again from another perspective to see what
interesting.
So if a necklace, for example, disappears on, I don't know, July the 6th of 1979, you have to really, and you know this as a writer, you can't then see the necklace on July the 15th when you're telling the story again.
Right.
So stuff like that, that's where something as weird as this
Yeah, it makes
Whatever
total
reason,
sense.
printing it out is easier for me to just scan than on my computer. I completely write on a computer.
Yeah, yeah. But having the sort of the spatial
Yeah,
representation of time, especially if you're doing multiple timelines, I can absolutely see, because even within the timeline, your character is thinking back to something that happened before, or
right.
and that is that you really have to sort of figure out, where am I in this moment, and when did that thing happen compared to this moment. That makes total sense to
Because
me.
it will mess you up.
Mm,
And the other thing I would say about writing is, for me, my little brain, the actual passage of time is very helpful for me to solve problems. I'm not the slowest writer, I mean, but I'm not the fastest writer. And sometimes I'll figure things out, and I think this is true for everyone, when I'm not writing, or
of
something
course,
will
right,
come to me in the middle of the
right.
night. And with one book, there was a moment where a character sets an alarm, but something happens in the middle of the night. And I realized she can't set the alarm because of that thing that happened in the middle of the night. The other people in the house would know that alarm would be ringing and ringing and ringing and ringing the next morning. So that, it just seemed like a natural thing to set the alarm, but
Right.
it was a little bit of time and reflection. I wasn't even reflecting. It just came out of the blue, the
Right. It's
solution.
your subconscious is at work, right? All that time. I think it's like it's like you said in the middle of the night, you wake up with like, it's that sort of half asleep brain that's so wonderful about not processing all the stuff that we're processing all day, which is, the laundry or the kids or
Yeah,
whatever all those things are. But it's processing that stuff that's way deep when you're not awake enough to be processing the sort of minutia, which I think is why you got to keep a pen or paper by your bed, unless, if your husband
totally.
is one who gets mad when you turn the light on, which mine is. So, I think, I mean, not mad, but frustrated. He does not like light in the middle of the night, but you got to keep something by your bed so you can capture those moments, because I used to think, oh, it's so good, it's so smart, I'll remember it in the morning, and then nope,
You never do. You
never.
never do. So I keep a pen and a pad by the bed.
Me too.
And what I do is I have one of those teeny little alarms with a
Yeah.
battery, where if you press the button, there's a little light. It's
Yes.
enough for you to write a couple words that you can actually read the next
I know
day.
that. I've done that too. I've actually taken notes, like in the dark, and woken up and they've been sort of all in one little lump, and it's taken
You
me
write
quite a long
over
time.
yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
your sense of space isn't quite right when you're blind. It's an interesting. It's totally true, but it is. I think that's really smart, and I think that's
Yeah.
really useful. So do you sort of have a sense, like, the what if part of it? Are there, if you're in that stage where you're sort of stuck, you have a lot of what ifs and you're not really sure where you're going, you're somebody who probably needs to walk away and garden or hike or do something
Yeah.
else.
I definitely do that. I mean, I try to schedule writing time on my computer or my phone. I try to block it out.
Yeah.
I generally try to block out 3 to 6 hour chunks. After 6 hours is a lot, and under 3, I feel like I haven't really sorted out my head to even get there yet. And it helps me to put it on my calendar. And
Yeah.
then I do have to walk away and do other things. And I lay out papers everywhere. I just like the visual sense of it. I'm in a cool space. I'll show you.
Yeah, it's
I'm
gorgeous. I can see
overlooking,
the reflection in the mirror
this
or
is
in
a
the window.
conservatory,
Ah, what a
and I'm
beautiful.
overlooking a river here,
Oh my
which you
gosh.
can see, and you can see my table.
Oh, it's
This used to
beautiful.
be, we used to have a lot of dinners here, but
Yeah.
I sort of have taken it over, and I have a little home office right off the kitchen, but I find that is kind of, busy central. And this is at the
Right.
other house. It's a little room we added on, and it also has a radiant heat floor because it's very cold right now.
Right.
But yeah, and I'm in a glass room, so the radiant heat is something.
I know. We just remodeled the basement where I am, and I had bookshelves put in and all this, and I have radiant floor. And I actually like to write when it's like 76 degrees. So I have a little room that's glassed
Oh,
in. And actually you can see mine too. It's my little glassed in room over there.
oh, I love
And
that.
I can make that really warm and have it be much more sort of normal temperatures in this sort of bigger room with where the books
Right.
are. So
Right.
yeah,
Oh, that's
it's
interesting. So one of the things I do, now we're talking about body heat and body comfort.
yeah.
I keep a heating pad out here. When it
Oh.
gets really cold, I'll just put the heating pad behind my back.
Mm-hmm.
Because it can get chilly out here, even with the radiant heat.
And your fingers, like I find if my fingers are cold, then it's, I'm kind of, for somebody who lives in Montana, I'm pretty wimpy about cold. So I have few big sweaters I like to wear, but I really just prefer it to be sort of lovely and warm. But I want to go back to talking about the pandemic because I feel like, God, what an interesting time to be a writer. And there's lots of people are sort of, lots of writers are very mixed on how it was to
That's
write during
right.
that time and also, to write about that time. So tell us about that, both writing during and writing about.
Yeah. Well, writing during turned out to be a very good thing because I was quarantined, or what do we call it? Sheltering in place in Palm Beach.
Yeah.
It was beautiful. So we have a house down there, and I was with my husband, my adult daughter, Alexandra, her husband, Cody, and granddaughter, Annabelle, who just turned 1, and 3 dogs. So the house was bedlam because nobody was coming to help. We were there on our own, and I happened to be a little tidier than everybody. So I bought a Roomba on Amazon, and I had a romance with my Roomba. I named him Orlando after
Oh,
the male character. I don't know if I'll call him a protagonist in Ruby Falls. So Orlando was my friend. He kept, because we had, with 3 dogs, we had like dog hair tumbleweed rolling around the house. And so that helped. I would lock myself in a room and I would write, and I would let Orlando do his thing in the house. I had a lot of time to write, and setting it in the pandemic, I thought it was a very useful vehicle for a thriller. It was like wartime. It imposed a set of constraints on the
yeah.
character, such as Linda Alonso not being able to follow her husband, that really boxed the story in nicely. Alice McDermott, in her new book on writing, which is called What About the Baby, she makes a distinguishing feature between writing nonfiction and fiction. With nonfiction, the story is known. So you have to take the whole story and small it down and get it on the page. With fiction, the story is infinite. You can go anywhere. So your first task as a fiction writer is to impose some limits, box it in a little bit. The pandemic worked very well that way.
Yeah.
The other thing, looking back on it, and it's not a huge part of the story, but it's the setting. I also feel like when you're writing kind of day and date about something that's actually going on, it's a little bit of history. So there's a moment where the writer looks at the television and she sees that ship coming into New York Harbor, and it was called Comfort, and it was supposed to be a hospital ship. And I remember seeing that and thinking, this really is like a war. I mean, there were field hospitals in Central Park.
I know. Yeah.
Like it in the Western world in our lifetimes. So
Mm-hmm.
just having those little snippets, they're tiny in the book, but it really contextualizes. And I think those things like 9/11, when they pop up, you have a sense of where you were. So I do think it was important to set it down. I know a lot of writers have tried to put books before and after.
Yeah.
But
Although after is never the same. After is never the same either. It's almost like, it's sort of hard to ignore, although I'm doing my best at the moment to just ignore it.
Yeah, well, that becomes futuristic, but it's also like technology.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about constraints in a book, like with Ruby Falls, I set it in the 1960s and the 1980s. And you have a whole kettle of fish just eliminated because you don't have to figure out the cell phone and the
Right.
computer and the
Right.
cameras. The little girl who's abandoned in the cave. There are no security cameras. There are no credit card records. There are no ways when the tour guides look at her, that they don't know who she came in with. They can't remember. And there's no record. So that
Right.
can solve a lot of problems.
So different. Yeah, exactly. And that is fun. It's really fun to lose the cell phone because it and all the CCTVs, which are making our lives so much harder but better. And you sort of mentioned the history part. The other thing about that I really appreciate about REEF ROAD was there's the whole chunk of history about Argentina and the dirty war and the horrors of that time, and particularly for women. So what sort of that is a whole different facet of the story. And how did you decide to incorporate that?
Gosh, how did I don't know why I put that in. I'd been to Argentina with one of my best friends whose family is from there. I had visited that detention center, which was in the middle of Buenos Aires, which that was the most chilling part. This is where, in the period of this military government, and they were taking all these people, mainly students and teachers and union leaders, and they would blindfold them and drive them around. So a lot of the people thought they were being taken far away from home. They were right in the middle of the city, like that, hiding in plain sight. It was an old military base. And so you go through it. It's a whole tour site. And you see the letters that these women, some of whom were pregnant, they made them write letters to their parents saying, dear mom and dad, things have been, I don't like it here anymore. I'm going to Paraguay or wherever they said they were going. And then the woman would give birth and they would take the baby, give it up for adoption, and they would throw her alive out of an airplane.
Unbelievable. Right. Unbelievable. What a weird way to.
And there's a huge
kill somebody.
postscript going on now. You have the grandmothers of these babies that were given up for adoption who are suing for people in their 40s now to submit to DNA testing. It's a famous case of a brother and a sister raised by a very prominent family, adopted at that time. And this association of mothers in the white headscarves, they want their DNA records. And these adults now are saying, we don't want to do it. So it's a moral conundrum.
Right.
And I don't make any comment about what should be done about it now, but it's fascinating.
Well, I think it is fascinating. It's another sort of way of looking at this is a lot of it explores women and their sort of the ways in which we are traditionally limited, controlled by men, and that is another that's a really horrible example. But of course, it happens also within the marriage, and I think Linda and Miguel's marriage is, in some ways, right, he's I think the Argentinian, he's more traditional, and that limits her freedom as well. So
yeah,
it's a wonderful commentary. The other so the other part of the story is the idea of writing about a writer, so that's a different, it's, obviously we read those books where, one of the characters is a writer, but that also seems like it must have been sort of an interesting thing to explore, because it's not you, although, right, you are bringing to it all of your sort of writerly things. So, what was that fun to sort of.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And I think, writing for me is always informed by having been an actress back in the day, and a lot of the techniques I learned of delving into a character. And it was always, as an actor, it's always about bringing yourself into the character, bits of yourself. Back when I did the TV movie about Ted Bundy with Mark Harmon. He played Ted Bundy, and I played the woman who married him. And so when you're in a moment like that and you're researching this woman and you're thinking, well, I have to make a decision about why on earth she would marry him. And the decision I made was she didn't know. She didn't believe it. That's just what I decided. that was the piece of me that I could bring to it, that for me to have married a serial killer, I would have to just not believe it.
I would hope that would be true for most women, but yes, that makes
you
sense.
think that she wouldn't just find it kind of a hot character trait.
Yeah, right, a turn on. No.
So with writing about being a writer, I did bring pieces of myself, but exaggerated. I can be a worrywart and a thinker and an obsessor in the middle of the night. I allowed those characteristics to run rampant. It's like if you're playing a murderer as an actress. Chances are you've never murdered anybody. Let's hope. But chances are you have felt every single human emotion available to any of us. So you pick one, jealousy, and you work it. You kind of, it's, that's why writing is exhausting. I'm sure you agree, because you're going there. You're go dig into that thing that normally in our real lives, we're not going to allow ourselves to dig in.
Right.
Like obsession is kind of a mental, wheel. And if you gauge that, and the writer lives a lot in that space.
Yeah, she does. She's a really interesting character. And I thought that was, and of course, not giving anything away, but as the story between them develops, I thought, there's so many interesting, wonderful things. Another thing, I mentioned this, I do all these tabs, which I love, but there's one, and I wrote it down because I loved it so much, because this, of course, here we are as Killer Women. This one, the quote was, "A slut," she'd once read, "was a woman with the morals of a man." Which I thought was so great. It just made me, it made me chuckle and think.
Well, that's right. Because that refers to one of the characters who might be, a little bit sexually active. And why is that? I have read that. And I think it just needs to be said, because I do think we still feel that way.
Yeah. Right. Maybe we're getting better, but not that much better. So another thing with the book is sort of inherited behaviors, right? Not just, violence, and there's the question of nurture and nature there, but also sort of personality disorders, and the like. And, I guess I want to know, like, what do you think? Like, do these things, are they inherited? Is it sort of we inherit them because we watch a role model, behave that way? What do you think?
I think a lot of things about that. And I just read an extraordinary book called It Didn't Begin With You. And it's about epigenetics. And I had never heard the term epigenetics until I finished REEF ROAD. So REEF ROAD does deal heavily with generational trauma. Yeah. And it's a real thing. And I think we know that there's cultural generational trauma. If you look at, the genocide of the Native Americans or the enslavement of people who came from Africa, there is inherited trauma from all Absolutely. Of that. So the way epigenetics works, it's a little bit different. With my mother's best friend being murdered. Okay, let's look at it this way. I know my mother's best friend was murdered. I know the effect it had on her. I know the effect it had on me. That's a kind of generational trauma. But in this book, they talk about inherited trauma that people don't know about. So, for example, one of the cases in the book, there was a 7-year-old Cambodian boy. He and his parents had immigrated to the United States from Cambodia, and the boy was acting out very violently. He was smashing his own head on things and hitting things with a coat hanger. The parents went to see a therapist. And it came out, the little boy was not in the room. It came out that the little boy's grandfather had been bludgeoned in the head to death by the Khmer Rouge in that period of the killing fields. And the family, wanting to move forward in the United States of America, this beautiful new life they had just buried the whole thing. Didn't mention him, didn't tell the kid. The kid had a step-grandfather that he thought was his biological grandfather. And the therapist said, you need to tell your son in an age-appropriate way about his grandfather and what happened. And the parents resisted. They said, no, we're here. We're looking forward. And the therapist said, you cannot look forward if you do not bring this out into the open with your son. And about a month after it, they put a picture of the grandfather. They spoke again in an age-appropriate way about what happened to him. A month later, the child took the coat hanger and gave it to his mother and said, I don't need to play this game anymore. So I do think there's something, they tell about an experiment with mice where one generation of mice, when exposed to a certain smell, they get an electric shock. 2 generations later, the mice, if they smell that smell, have reactions of stress and anxiety. So I think
it's so
more to it than we understand.
Yeah.
I'm not a scientist. The book says basically the actual genes don't change, but the genetic affect changes. I don't really, I mean, I understand the words, but I don't know the details of how that could be.
That is exactly how I've read about it, is that the genes are sort of conditioned to cause different behaviors or to react differently because of, you know, stresses and stimuli from earlier generations. It's super interesting. I'm curious about that book. I'll have to check it out. But it makes total sense to me. And you don't even need necessarily to have a violent experience as a child to be, you know, impacted by violence in your own history, right? Or your cultural history.
Or things you don't know. Yeah, it's fascinating. Read that book. We can talk forever about it. So yes, I do feel, and I will tell you, so this terrible thing happened to my mother's best friend. And many years later, one of my daughters, and I won't go into detail because these are young people who are still living, was violently attacked in circumstances very similar, in proximity of relationship very similar. And she survived and she's fine, and thank goodness, and it's been a long road to recovery. She's great. But what are the odds that I, here in this middle generation, would be bookended by these violent home attacks of best friends of my mother and my daughter? It doesn't make any sense in a logical capacity. I mean, what's going on with that? So there is something to the epigenetic pattern going on.
Yeah, so that is real. I'm so sorry to hear that. It's and it impacts, I mean, those, you know, I'm sure your daughter, the impact on her is
absolutely
really intense.
Yeah.
And, you know, another, you know, sort of theme of the story is about identity, in particular, you know, obviously female identity. And it seems to me that is also something that really interests you. You were talking about sort of how you find, you know, the thing in common with a role you're going to play. So, you know, I mean, talk about that. What, you know, when you're writing your characters, how you're discovering their identity, and what about that sort of matters?
Well, I think we all exist on so many levels. And most of us, all the different levels we exist on, are within a range of normal. You know, a range. We might have our moments when we lose it, or we're, you know, we have our high stress or our, you know, anxiety attacks or whatever, but it's still in a range. But I think I'm very intrigued by the outliers, the people who cross lines, the people who have secrets of a magnitude that most of us don't carry. Like Ted Bundy, he's a different case. He's a psychopath. That's a particular thing. So, I mean, I always like something about my characters, but I like playing with who people really are and what it is that they're not revealing to us when we first meet them. I would really like that.
Sorry, I apologize if you can hear my little dogs upstairs barking. I agree. I think it is really interesting. And I think you can I think the thing that's fun about being a writer is that nobody is entirely good or entirely evil. And that's true, of course, for your characters. And there are things where, you know, there's frustration we experience with characters. There's, you know, empathy and sympathy and, you know, occasionally pity. And and then, you know, and disappointment, but it's all there. You know, those are all wrapped in, because they're human. And that to me is a sign of, you know, a really well created character. So
Yeah,
that's
I would
fabulous.
agree.
So this is out January 10th.
That's
January
right.
10th. And so tell us, I know you're on social media. Are you also, I'm sure you have a website. Tell us where's the best place to find Reef Road?
So I have a great website, DeborahGoodrichRoyce.com, and that lists all my events, including the events I host in Rhode Island at the Ocean House Hotel. And we have to get you there, Danielle, to beautiful.
Amazing. I've heard it's incredible.
I would love to have you there. So we can schedule that. And so I do a whole summer series that's now starting to eke out into off season. And the whole tour schedule's on. It's a very robust tour schedule. And I'm also very active, mainly on Instagram. And that's Deborah Goodrich Royce official. And we added the official because I had two people impersonating me, including a much more beautiful, younger, more buxom brunette. And I'm like, why are you
why do you want to be me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, since we're on the Ocean House, which I have heard about, tell us a little bit about what you do there, because I think that's something that will be of super interest to our listeners as well.
Yeah, so we're in Watch Hill, Rhode Island, which is a beautiful summer resort, not too far from Newport. So that kind of sets the tone. The Ocean House is a big Victorian seaside hotel from the 1860s that my husband and I bought and restored and reopened, and we own with a whole bunch of partners. And this author series is many Wednesdays in the summer and sometimes off season. And we do generally a Wednesday evening conversation. We have wine and hors d'oeuvres, and people come, and it's great.
Ah, sounds amazing. Sign me up. Okay, well, I would love to talk about that. That sounds fabulous. Okay, so now that I've devoured Reef Road, I have to ask, what are you working on? What's next?
Well, let me tell you. So I got an email several months ago from a man, and he said, "Hi, do you remember me? I was your best boy in Survival Game." Now that's a very provocative opening line. So best boy in a movie is the head electrician. It's the term that they use. And Survival Game was a movie I did. And he went on to give all these little touch points of a dinner we had, or running into each other, or all these other things. And I thought, I don't remember any of this. And that's kind of interesting. What if it's real? What if it's not real? And it got me thinking, and I'm playing with a book now called Best Boy.
Oh my God, I love it. It sounds like a thriller just served itself up to you via email. And it also sounds like you might have a stalker. So I would say
no, this guy checked out. He was totally normal. But that might not be where it goes in the book. But
right. Well, no, of course not. But I actually just even think just that the whole email and the fact that it was called Survival Game. I mean, so much about that.
That was the name of the movie. Yeah, we shot that in Santa Cruz, California.
What a fabulous hook! You got me.
I was your best boy. What a thing to say. I mean, you could take that on so many levels.
As a non-actor and unfamiliar with that term or anything really about that world, I was like, when did you play something called Survival Game, and what would a best boy be? Yeah, I think that sounds like a fabulous hook, and I love the title Best Boy too, because it seems very menacing, even though it seems also very benign, right?
Dark, yeah.
Very dark and menacing. That sounds fabulous. Okay, Deborah, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you. I loved Reef Road. I know readers will love it too. Tell us a few of the places. I've already heard it's like, it's on the most anticipated. Can you think off the top of your head where it's most anticipated?
It's on the Indie Next list. So bookstores across the country will have it on the Indie Next list for January. It's on the most anticipated books from Zibby Award. So it's kind of,
It's out there. I love it. Well, I hope it sells 1 million copies because that would be super fun. And in the meantime, I know, right? From my lips to whoever's listening. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Danielle. Really nice.
Oh God, so great. And this has been Killer Women today with our guest, Deborah Goodrich Royce. And we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.